Now, when I learned I would have one more opportunity in this Winter in the Psalm series to teach a psalm, I very quickly picked my go-to psalm personally, pastorally. It's Psalm 139. It's absolutely my favorite psalm. So I am really grateful to be able to teach this psalm today because it really is genuinely my go-to in so many situations. Now, this has got a little bit of a unique twist to it in that I can recall the precise moment when this psalm sort of penetrated my heart and I kind of fell in love with it. So it's a very specific occurrence. So real quick, I'll paint the picture. So I'm 18 years old. I had come to Edmonton to go to college. And that winter, somewhere either late fall of 1984 or early January, February, somewhere in 85, I went to a concert with my roommate and a few friends at the Northern Alberta Jubilee Auditorium, the Jube, as we call it in Edmonton. It was a concert featuring Michael W. Smith and Kathy Tacoli. Now, some of you in the room, you're with me, you're my generation, you're my vintage. You might recognize these names. Others of you, you weren't even born yet, so I understand that. But at the time, Michael W. Smith was a big deal in kind of Christian contemporary music. And Kathy Tacoli was an up-and-comer. And we had phenomenal seats. We were like the third or fourth row at the Jube. And a whole bunch of us were there. And this was like big lights, big sound and haze, and just a Christian rock show, if you will. Late in the concert, though, Michael W. Smith kind of stripped everything down in like a single spotlight, and he gave a little bit of his testimony. He talked a bit about his faith journey, and whatever he said, I don't recall exactly what he said about his life and about his journey, but he led to this point where he began to recite Psalm 139. And after all of the big noise and sound and lights and smoke and haze and all of that, just hearing this man describe this psalm and reciting it into the quiet of this room just penetrated my heart. And I really legitimately felt like God was speaking to me through Michael W. Smith through this psalm. Words like this: "Oh Lord, you've searched me and you know me. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out, my lying down. You're familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely, O Lord. Where can I flee from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I make my bed in the depths of my heavens, you are there." And then this line: "You created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I am fearfully and wonderfully made." That's just a few lines from the 24 verses that make up Psalm 139. And so for the next few minutes, what I want to do is walk you through the psalm in its entirety. I want to help you get better connected with it. I want to try to help you grab hold of the psalm. I want you to know about it for sure, but I want to encourage you to make it yours and to pray it and to interact with it. So we'll be projecting the verses that we'll be walking through on the screens to help you follow along. But if you were to look at this in an actual hard copy Bible, or maybe even a device, you might notice something that's right across the top of Psalm 139. This is how it begins. It begins with a heading: "For the director of music of David, a psalm." Now, in our Bibles, most of the headings and the chapter divisions and the verse notations, they're put there by editors. But this is an example of the heading coming from the original Hebrew text. Like, this is there in the early manuscripts. It's like a signature. This is a psalm of David, King David, the guy from the statue, the famous leader in Israel, the man after God's own heart, that David. And it looks like he's writing to a particular person, the director of music. Now, who this is kind of a mystery. We really don't know. Some think it's a guy named Asaph. Asaph is one of the ancient Levi priests, one of the three priests commissioned by David to oversee the singing in the house of Yahweh, the Hebrew God. Or the director of music could be one of the other Levitical leaders, or it could be David's way of referring to God himself. Maybe God is the director of music. So who exactly this is addressed to is kind of guesswork, but David is absolutely credited with authorship. David, the son of Jesse, David, the king of Israel, David, the one who's described in 2 Samuel as the sweet psalmist of Israel. And this is a sweet psalm, believe me. Excuse me, I might do that a couple of times. Quick side note, my wife and I just got back from a trip. We were in Mexico City, and I think we got the crud on the airplane coming home. And so I might have to, you might have to, I'm not sure we can time the mute button quickly enough on this, but anyway, bear with me on that. So here we go, verse 1. You've searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. You hem me in, behind and before, and you lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. So David is praying a passionate prayer to the covenant God of Israel. And he's leaning into this idea that Yahweh God is personally acquainted with him, which is a unique perspective in his day. See, in David's time, the various tribes and people groups have their own understanding of the gods, and most of the gods they describe are not really hostile toward humanity, but they're largely indifferent. Now, if you ever studied ancient Roman and Greek gods, maybe you've heard that description of them being sort of uninterested in humanity. Yet David sees Yahweh as a God who's intimately connected to his people. You've searched me, and you know me. So here's the first idea to take from Psalm 139. It's not enough to say that God knows everything. I think that's an accurate statement, by the way. I believe God knows everything, but what we're learning here is the God who knows everything knows you. This is more than a statement about God being everywhere. The more fulsome idea here is God is everywhere with you. The scriptures teach that God is the creator of everything. Yes, but the psalm says God has created you. This is David's understanding. God, you know me? And the part which says, God discerns my going out and my lying down, that's a common Hebrew phrase. God, you know everything about me, the routine and seemingly insignificant things about me. You know those too. Jesus will later describe in Matthew how God knows the number of hairs on your head, which I got to be honest means more to probably some of you than it does me. The point is, God knows you, and he knows you intimately. He knows everything. He knows the trivial things. David says, God knows our thoughts. He even knows your words, my words, before we even speak them. Nothing is hidden before this all-knowing God. He's familiar with all your ways. Now, if this is true, if God knows all, sees all, and knows what you're going to say before you even say it, maybe you ought to think before you speak, right? If you sense that in God's presence there's a way you should speak, well, according to Psalm 139, you are in God's presence. And in verse 5, David says, you hem me in behind and before. Some English translations say you hedge me in. In most examples of this in the scripture, the language being used here is describing a protective barrier, thick, thorny hedges planted around vineyards and orchards to keep the critters out, the predators and the pests. My wife and I have a son, Andrew. He and his wife, Willow, live in Camrose, a little bit south of Edmonton. And they love to grow gardens and have vegetables in the summer. My son's really good at this stuff. But one of the challenges they have in Camrose are the deer. I don't know if you have that problem here, but the deer are everywhere in Camrose, and they're just they're just all over the community, and you can't hardly keep them out of your yard or out of your garden. So my son and his wife, they have a short fence, but the deer just jump the fence all the time, and it's very regular for them in the summertime to open up the drapes in the morning or look out in the backyard, and there's 6 deer just hanging out in their garden, just having snacks, that sort of thing. Andrew could use a big, thick, thorny hedge to keep those critters out. This is the idea of David's psalm. God's hedged or hemmed him in, not to trap him, but to protect him so that nothing gets to David. Nothing gets to David unless it goes through God first. This hedge of protection from God himself is what David has going for him, which is nice. Now, I should probably say something about this business of God knowing and seeing everything, because for some of you, that might not sound like a good thing. That might I'm not sure how I feel about that. That might even be a little bit disturbing. It might sound like what it's like to live in a place where those in authority go to great lengths to keep their eyes on everybody. Nobody likes being watched, right? Nobody really wants to live under intense scrutiny. That's part of what fuels our culture here in the West, fuels our culture here in a place like Alberta. Get off me. We don't want the government spying on us, that sort of thing. We don't like law enforcement being able to just peer into our lives. We know that there are places on the planet that are more like police states than free societies. So I get that this idea of every thought and action being scrutinized is not enticing to everybody. None of us wants somebody to be listening in on all of our conversations. Yet, a bunch of us have devices in our pockets or on our wrists and in our homes that are listening to everything. So even, for example, check this out. Hey, Siri, what's the temperature outside?
It's minus 10 degrees outside.
Did you hear that? Okay. So Siri has to be listening to me constantly because I have to activate Siri by a specific word, yet Siri has to be listening to me the whole time to hear that simple word. It is kind of creepy when you think about it, how the things are listening to us, right? But the idea in Psalm 139 is it's not a hostile or creepy or invasive surveillance. David is appealing to the good intentions and the loving nature of the one who is watching and listening. Maybe a better way to think about this kind of scrutiny would be like that of a baby monitor in a child's room. Now, when our children were babies, we had audio monitors, right? Some of you had those. Some of you parents now have all kinds of telemetry on your child, right? You've got video stuff, you've got audio stuff, you might have little leads and monitor. There's all kinds of things that parents can do now. The point is, a camera over a crib, an audio monitor, those are acts of love. It's a camera of love, of concern and care. David's praying to a God of comfort and care and concern and protection. He's resting in God's presence. When a child knows that a loving parent is watching over them, they're more at ease. That's the idea. So God's knowledge and presence is supposed to be a comfort to you. It's not supposed to scare you or terrify you. When David says, "You lay your hand upon me," this is not the hand of oppression. It is the beautiful touch of God's grace. Let's keep going. We're up to verse 7. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. This is more elaboration on the mind-blowing idea that God is everywhere. Where can I go that your spirit is not? Where can I possibly go? Now, in theological terms, we describe this as God's omnipresence, the existence of God filling every corner of the universe. But David's not a pantheist. In David's understanding, God is everywhere, but God is not everything. David is simply recognizing that in the very best way, everywhere he goes, God is there too. Now, while we're on this section, I should address something that's kind of fascinating. In verse 8, specifically the part where David says in our English translation, if I make my bed in the depths, you are there. Or some translations say, if I make my bed in hell or Sheol, you are there. The Hebrew word is Sheol, and the way it's used in the Old Testament varies. It's described as a vast cavern or tomb in Ezekiel, a stronghold in various Psalms, a dark wasteland in Job and Habakkuk and Jonah. Now, the language is not always definitive, but usually it's poetic, it's evocative, it's associated with death. And it looks like what David is saying is no matter where we are, even after this life, in heaven or hell, even there, God is present, which is fascinating, or maybe more accurately, unusual, because most of the Psalms portray Sheol as a place of divine absence. And here we have this description of divine presence in the place of the dead or the underworld. Am I making you think a little bit here? What does this mean? I wish we knew. I'm not sure. So let me just offer some help. Maybe this is helpful. Perhaps God's omnipresence is so overwhelming, and the scriptures say that it is. And if hell is as we commonly understand it, in some way, God's presence is still there. Maybe limited in some way, perhaps limited to his judgment. Not sure. But anytime we talk about the afterlife, heaven and hell and all that kind of stuff, we're doing theology. And I want to just explain the difference between kind of exegetical work like we do in sermons and theology. Theology includes the study of the nature of God as we see his presence in the natural world. We incorporate general revelation as we see him described in nature around us, as well as the scriptures, special revelation, especially as we see what's described in the life of Jesus himself, the ultimate special revelation. But when we're doing theology, what we're doing is we're sifting through the whole length and depth of scriptures for perspective. We're kind of looking at the big picture. So somehow what we're seeing here in Psalm 139, if we go to the heavens, God is definitely there. That's not hard to make sense of. But if we go to hell, God is also there in some way, perhaps in a redemptive way, or maybe in a judgmental, holy way. In either way, the main idea for David is that God's presence is everywhere. There's no escaping it. It's pervasive. There's nowhere to run. There's nowhere to hide. There's no place beyond the reach of God's hand. And that's a good thing, by the way. But for the purposes of time, I'm going to skip over verses 11 and 12. That's where David describes God's constant presence as a light in the darkness, another description of God's presence. But before I press on, let me just kind of step back here for a second and restate what we've covered so far. At this point, we have a beautiful psalm which reminds us that we have a creative, glorious God with us everywhere. And his is a welcoming, protective, guiding presence that should be awesome, that should be encouraging to you. By the way, are you seeing why this is a go-to psalm? Why I read this to people when I want to provide some comfort and assurance? Not that long ago, I read it to a person minutes before they passed away. They were still very coherent, and I read the psalm to them, and 10 minutes later, they were gone. It's a lovely psalm. And by the way, I don't know what's going on in David's life as he writes these words. He could be writing during a good season when his heart is swelling with gratitude. It could be that he writes this during a bad season. He has plenty of those. You've seen in the Psalms already that David laments a lot. A bunch of his prayers, his Psalms, are filled with frustration and sometimes even despair. It could be that David is preaching to himself. It could feel to him that God is far away, but David is saying, he's reminding himself, God, when you feel distant, I'm going to choose to believe in what I know about you, that you're near. By the truth of your word, I'm going to trust that you're there. I'm going to sing in your presence because I believe that you are with me even when I want to question it. I'm just reminding you that sometimes the biblical writers don't speak from, theological mountaintops, emotional mountaintops, when they're all confident in the presence and goodness and grace of God. Sometimes, often, they speak from the pit. And in the pit, they just cling to the promise of nearness of God. So that's the message so far. God is with, and God is with you. Now, verse 13. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. So David's back to God knows all about me. And where he starts in Psalm 139 is God knows me. Then he spins to God is everywhere. Now he's back to his starting point and he's going to go next level. God, you knew me before I even emerged into the world. Now, stating the obvious, this is one of the places where a vast number of Christ-following people anchor their convictions around protections of the unborn, a subject which I know triggers strong emotions in people all over our culture. I know that some of you, even if you're personally pro-life in all that it typically means, you also may potentially carry the conviction that reproductive rights and bodily autonomy are fundamentally justice issues. And I'm very aware that many in our culture don't react real well when men stand here and talk about this stuff. So I want to acknowledge that I will never have to make the kind of choices which are often thrust on women in general, on women of color, on young women and their parents, on women in all sorts of extenuating circumstances, as well as women who've been raped and abused or manipulated sexually. Psalm 139 is not the only place in the scriptures we can go or should go to for guidance on how to navigate these very difficult contemporary issues, but let's be intellectually honest enough to admit the reasoning in this specific text. If God is intimately acquainted with us and involved in our very formation prior to our birth, well, then it makes sense to want to defend and preserve and fight for the unborn, seemingly innocent life. Now, having said that, I'm committed to learning and understanding different perspectives, both in and out of the church, and I ask that you extend grace to me and to each other. Please, this is a very sensitive topic. But before I even leave this, while we're here, what do we do for or say to parents who learn of severe defects in their child prior to birth, or when a genetic defect surfaces after birth? What do we do with David's words about every person being knit together by God and that they're wonderfully made? Does God make mistakes? If you're watching online, by the way, I don't know what's going on where you are, but it's real quiet in the room right now. It just is. Right? This part is very personal to some of you. Maybe painful is the right word. I'm sorry for what some of you are or have faced, and there's no reasoning that I can offer you that will satisfy you. But one perspective that I've found somewhat helpful is to think about defects as injuries to God's original design. In the same way that a person out of the womb can be injured or contract illness or disease, a child can be injured or genetically altered in the process of formation. As unsatisfying as these words may land, in the same way that some face injury or disease out of the womb, some experience it in the womb. And why? I have no answer. I can't even begin to answer that. But I try to take solace in the idea that injury and imperfections that we see are the result of us living in a broken world. We believe that what's broken here will ultimately be restored. So if you feel, when you hear the words fearfully and wonderfully made, if you feel less than, or you love someone who may feel this way because of injury or illness or imperfection, the whole of Scriptures, again, doing theology now, the whole of Scripture teaches that every single human being is an image bearer of God and is fearfully and wonderfully made, known and loved, and the same God in his infinite wisdom and understanding ultimately has something good and glorious in mind for those he loves. This is the big idea. I think that's the main point of Psalm 139. I'm almost done, but there's a big plot twist near the end that we can't ignore. I said I read this psalm to people sometimes when I'm caring for them or when I'm supporting them because it's a beautiful poetic psalm which speaks in glowing terms about God's loving presence and intimate knowledge of us. God, you know all about me. You made me wonderfully. You fill the universe with your presence. That's the tone that David carries for 18 verses. But in verse 19, there's a change. And frankly, it's kind of jolting. It's kind of, it's like shifting without a clutch. Here it is. If only you, God, would slay the wicked. Away from me, you who are bloodthirsty. They speak of you with evil intent. Your adversaries misuse your name. Do I not hate those who hate you, Lord, and abhor those who are in rebellion against you? I have nothing but hatred for them. I count them my enemies. David's having a bad day. I'm not sure what happened to cause David to shift from this wonder and adoration to active prayer against his enemies. But for some reason, David starts railing against those who he believes belong in the category of the wicked. So what's going on? I wish I knew. I really don't. But it appears like David's deep-rooted confidence and adoration of God has him filled with a zeal to defend God's honor when he sees someone questioning God's wisdom and character. Do I not hate those who hate you? David's undeniably on God's side, which is how he justifies his hate. He hates those who hate God. I don't want to suggest that we imitate David here. At least not imitate literally. Listen, in this room, a lot of us, maybe even most of us, we follow Jesus, and his words and instruction sometimes need to counterbalance, even sometimes correct the kings and the prophets of old. Are you comfortable with me saying that? Like Jesus' words, I think, this is my opinion now, I think they're a little bit more heavily weighted than some of the Old Testament Hebrew scriptures. For example, Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, never return evil done to us with evil toward another person. Don't respond to the hatred of others with your own hatred. Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. It's a bit of a difference there, right? So I'm not going to suggest that we mimic David, except in maybe this respect. We should imitate the way David loves God so deeply that he cannot help himself but to react to the evil that he sees around him. I mean, one way to love God is to oppose the evil that exists in this world. And by the way, Jesus doesn't lead with all love and no correction or no conviction. He does both. But interestingly, those who are considered wicked in his day are drawn to him, not because he doesn't challenge them or try to correct their behaviors. He just has such a winsome, engaging presence that those who are far from God like being around him. They like eating with him and talking with him and being in his presence. Just food for thought. Okay, so David's got one more abrupt turn in him. To summarize one more time, most of this psalm is worshipful. It's this glowing adoration of our Creator God who made us carefully and skillfully. He knows us intimately and deeply. These are the thoughts that lead to David expressing with strong language distress over evil that he sees. This is a prayer, remember? He asks God to do something about those who mock him and flaunt their participation in some of the world's evils. But this isn't the end. I've been teaching Psalm 139 for a long time. I used to teach this to junior high and high school kids when I was a young youth pastor. And I would sometimes really drill in on this part. And I would say to them, listen, when you feel yourself getting amped up, ready to lash out at somebody and criticize someone and just let them have it, verbally attack somebody, maybe this is where you ought to follow the example of David, who is on the attack. And suddenly, I'd like to think under the influence of God's Spirit, suddenly David turns his gaze inward. Search me, God. Know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any offensive way in me and lead me in the way of everlasting. If verses 19 to 22, if those verses sound like the words of kind of a self-righteous jerk, well, if that's the only part of Psalm 139 that you read, I can see how you might reach that conclusion. But again, I want to do some theology here. When you're doing theology, you're applying the whole canon of Scripture. You're synthesizing things. You're looking at every angle, every testament, every genre, every perspective. Or stated more plainly, I think what our world needs right now is a lot more verses 23 and 24 and a little less of 19 to 22. This is how David prays. God, you know everything. You fill every place. You love all that is good, and you hate evil. And suddenly David rips his heart open before God, and he says, investigate my life, O God. Cross-examine me, test me, get a clear picture of what I'm about. See for yourself if I've been doing anything wrong, and then put me back on the right path. Now that is a robust, well-balanced prayer, a good one for all of us to pray. Remember, you've heard this before in this series, the Psalms are God's words to us, but by design and by intent, I believe they're there for us to make them our words to God. This is as honoring a prayer as you'll find in the Scriptures. It's a pretty courageous prayer too. And so I would encourage you to pray it and pray it frequently.